The word is cuisine, and it's spelled C-U-I-S-I-N-E. In French, there's a very straightforward meaning of cuisine, which is the kitchen, the place where you do the cooking. But it also has very much wider connotations. The art of cooking, for example, but much wider social and historical even connotations, which take in the whole notion of the production of food, the production and the preparation of food, the notion of a historical legacy that's handed down from generation to generation, and very importantly in France, the notion of discrimination, of knowing what good food is and knowing how to enjoy good food. When I'm talking about discrimination there, what I mean is this sense that there's a very particular French way of enjoying food and preparing food, and there's a wider notion even that the greatness of French cuisine expresses something particular about France. So la cuisine française in some ways stands as an index of la civilisation française, French civilization and French civilizing values. Really, in English, we've taken over, as far as I'm concerned, the wider connotations of the word. I mean, French learners will perhaps know it will be one of the first words you learn, la cuisine dans la maison. But we have this sense of cuisine as a broader culinary expression. So we would talk, for example, about French cuisine, but we might also talk about Italian cuisine. So we've taken on that broader social, cultural notion of what cuisine is. If you look at the history of cuisine, the history of, sometimes it's called gastronomy in France, you can see a series of movements. I'd point to two recent movements in particular. And these are very interesting because they bring up a series of social and even political connotations and meanings that are very interesting. The first one I'd point to is what's called, and English speakers will probably have heard of this, la nouvelle cuisine, literally new cuisine. And this grew up, it was a movement in France in the 70s really, the 70s and early 80s. The idea was to take the emphasis away from the use, for example, of heavy sauces, of high-calorie ingredients such as cream and egg yolk and sugar and brandy, that was part of traditional French fine cuisine. And everybody knows it, the notion of nouvelle cuisine, it's almost become a cliche. It evokes a big plate with very small portions. And the idea, as I say, was to move away from some of the orthodoxies of the past to focus on choosing the finest ingredients, cooking them often in a very simple way to protect and bring out the true flavours of these ingredients. So there was an emphasis there on newness and innovation, particularly in cooking methods. There was a growing recognition in France that heavy sauces, the use of high-calorie ingredients is not necessarily good for your health. Although, of course, people may have heard of something called the French paradox. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's the idea that the French, although they traditionally do indulge in some things which might be seen as bad for your health, generally levels of heart disease in France are quite good compared to somewhere like Great Britain. A very recent movement, a very interesting movement in food, as you might expect, based in Paris. And this dates back to the sort of turn of the century, turn of the 20th into the 21st century, around 2000. And there's a very interesting term, and it's significant that it's an Anglo-Saxon, it's an English borrowing. It's called le fooding. And the idea is to put together two English words, two borrowed words, le food and le feeling. And again, the idea here is to overturn, to challenge orthodoxies, to challenge the notion that food is based around, and food production and preparation is based around a series of sort of codified rules. So le fooding movement wants to focus particularly on the enjoyment of consuming food, the enjoyment of buying food, the enjoyment of the dining experience. I think this is very significant because it connects to a wider move in France, which is, it sort of exists around the presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy, an attempt to move, to reorientate French culture more towards a sort of Anglo-Saxon model of consumption, of enjoyment, breaking away from what's seen as a more traditional French rule-based approach to cuisine. So the fooding people say that even nouvelle cuisine, it arrived on the scene, it was something new, but it was based on, it created another series of rules. This idea of feeling, of putting feeling together with le food is very interesting, because traditionally French culture would have been somewhat suspicious of emotion, of feeling as a sort of public discourse. But again, I think this expresses, or attempts to express, some sort of reorientation of French culture along more Anglo-Saxon lines.